let's do the shimmy slide.
I don't think I was entirely prepared for what I was getting into when I decided to take a look at 1993's Champagne and Bullets, aka Road to Revenge, aka Get Even. Though that last one's all as one word, so I guess it should really be GETEVEN? My first exposure to the movie was from an early episode of Red Letter Media's Best of the Worst, where they covered the highlights of this thing? And what I saw was frankly so absurd in terms of presentation that I knew it was a movie that I had to get round to watching at some point. And, with Vinegar Syndrome releasing a rather lovely, and might I add comprehensive set in 2021, I made sure to nab myself one because, let's be honest, this is my kind of rodeo. The film was the brainchild of John De Hart, a now retired lawyer who decided almost completely on a whim that he wanted to write, direct, score, produce and star in his own gritty action cop drama thriller. And he did just that, self-funding the production and carrying it to a limited release in 1993 under the title Champagne and Bullets. It didn't gather that much momentum, so a short time later he recut the film to remove most of the nudity and sex scenes and also to cut down a few of the longer scenes, bringing the runtime down from 98-ish minutes to 75-ish minutes and retitling the picture Road to Revenge. This fared a little bit better and managed to get distribution. But it wasn't really until the early 2000s that De Hart would have one final crack of re-releasing the movie, reinserting some of the nudity and sex scenes and shooting 4 minutes of new footage that was also shot on standard videotape and not film like the rest of the movie. This cut clocks in at roughly 89 minutes and was retitled Get Even, and this version, for a time, was the best known cut of this movie out there. So this film's a bit like the Wicker Man of shite action cop thrillers, but I suppose the next question is, what makes this film so special that it deserves 3 separate cuts and a limited edition Blu-ray release? Well, the plot is more or less the same across the 3 cuts, but for clarity I'm going to be mainly talking about the Champagne and Bullets cut for the purposes of this review. The plot follows best buddies Rick and Hook, 2 cops just palling around and trying to get things done by the book. When the film opens, they're partnered up with a Tom Carvel-sounding motherfucker called Normad, and the film wastes no time in making it clear that Normad is the villain of this movie, as he leads Rick and Hook to stage a drugs bust without a warrant. Things don't quite go to plan, and the pair end up in court trying to defend their decision. Normad testifies against the pair, claiming that Rick and Hook are in fact drug takers and dealers, and that the bust that went down was in fact a drug deal that went bad. The judge sides with Normad, and Rick and Hook are kicked out of the force with immediate effect. Some time passes and Rick and Hook move in together and start doing some freelance security work to help make ends meet. This includes having to deal with obnoxious pompous frat boys as chauffeurs for prom night. It's not pretty, but it's good honest work. After getting off a particularly manic shift, Hook suggests the pair hit a bar for cowboy night, and it's here that the main thrust of the film really begins. Because when Rick and Hook enter the bar, they're greeted by Cindy, Cherry and Cindy's mum. And this is a blast from the past for Rick because Cindy and him were in a pretty serious relationship when Cindy mysteriously vanished without a trace. The pair reconnect briefly and Cindy rather cryptically explains that she's been in a bit of a bad place for a time and that she's come back to town to try and get her head back in the game, and that she's currently stopping with Cherry. It's clear almost immediately that the pair intend to rekindle things, but before that can go any further, Hook breaks the pair up because it's time for one of the greatest moments in cinematic history. For a solid 3 to 4 minutes, we as the audience are effectively captive, treated to a music video for the song The Shimmy Slide. And while I'm not going to risk angering the copyright claim gods here by playing a clip, I absolutely would not begrudge you if you paused the video here, searched The Shimmy Slide and just basked in the most awkward and absurd piece of work that I have seen in a long time. It's pretty much the sequence that anyone who watches this movie remembers, and with good reason. Anyway, while Rick's up there giving it his all, a rather sinister looking group enter the bar and almost immediately surround Cindy. They recognise her from somewhere. Cindy makes a break for Rick as soon as he gets off stage, and at the exact same time, 2 things occur. A woman gets on stage and starts stripping, and an outraged Karen calls the police to report indecent exposure, and while that's going on, Rick and Hook team up to protect Cindy in a small bar brawl that breaks out. The stripper doesn't stop stripping at any point during this brawl, by the way. It's a bizarre few minutes of bad punch sound effects and the gentlest tosses and tumbles you'll ever see. Anyway, the police turn up and Rick manages to avoid being arrested, but Hook's not so lucky and ends up behind bars for aggravated assault. Rick and Cindy's mum go to bail Hook out of jail, but the cost of bail pretty much bankrupts an already struggling Hook. This is put on the back burner, however, as we then spend an almost coma-inducing amount of time with Rick and Cindy, watching the pair have a romantic meal and make small talk before we catch up with them the next day hanging in someone's backyard on a swing. It's here that Cindy opens up a bit more about what happened to cause her to leave town mysteriously. Cindy says that she basically fell in with a bad crowd. She started doing drugs, the drugs got harder, the friends got fewer, and eventually she was sucked into the world of Satanism and devil worship. All was actually going pretty alright for Cindy, until she was attending a black mass where they announced they were going to sacrifice a live baby. This was apparently the stick that broke the camel's back for her, and she basically got up and started wailing and screaming during the sacrifice, ultimately ruining the event. The guys from the bar earlier removed her from the mass and bound and gagged her, and the next day when she was free she got her things together and fled back to her hometown to try and get away from it all. Unfortunately for her, the leader of the cult is none other than Nomad, as it's revealed that he's actually a drug-dealing cult leader running operations while being backed by the law. Rick doesn't know that Nomad is the cult leader, but comforts Cindy all the same. The pair embrace, and by this point they're pretty much back on as a couple. Back with Hook though, things aren't going so rosy. After being cleared out by the bail money, Hook's got nothing left to pay the bills, as illustrated by him standing in his bathroom literally shooting his bills and flushing them down the toilet. Things go from bad to worse when later that night Hook's ex-wife turns up demanding an alimony payment, as apparently Hook's quite behind on paying. When he tells her he can't pay, she does the perfectly reasonable thing and rips her dress open, calls the police screaming that Hook's trying to kill her, before cursing Hook out and running out of the house. The police end up taking Hook in for something between aggravated assault and attempted murder, and guess who the judge is who'll be hearing Hook's case? Nomad, who's now been promoted to the role of judge for some reason. I'm pretty sure it's lawyers who become judges, not cops. Anyway, as you can imagine, it's a kangaroo court and Hook gets hurled into jail with no bail. As soon as he gets in, he manages to trick a janitor into leaving his post before grabbing a bottle of bleach from his wheelie cart and treating it like water in the desert. A short time later, Hook's in the hospital where a chance encounter with a nun sets in motion a new path for Hook, and from here about a third of the film devolves into a weird mixture of padding and literal blink-and-you'll-miss-it plot points. So to save us both a lengthy breakdown, I'll just hit the key beats from here on in. Rick and Cindy go to see Hook, only to almost immediately leave him to go and grab the last of Cindy's things from her parents' house. They have a montage of lovey-dovey romance stuff. There's a bloody long sex scene that goes on for about 2.5 million years between Rick and Cindy. Hook becomes a full-blown religious wacko, Rick and Cindy get married. On their honeymoon night, Cindy does an ultra-long striptease to the Shimmy Slide that lasts about 2.2 million years, and the bad gang update Nomad about Cindy and Rick and everything that's going on, and Nomad demands that Cindy be killed because she knows too much. Which takes us up to the final act, where Cindy finds a picture of Nomad and immediately recognises him as the cult leader. She tells Rick and the pair head out to inform the police, but the bad guys spot the pair leaving and decide to give chase. In a barnstorming finale that actually is probably some of the best parts of this movie, will Rick and Cindy bust Nomad? Will Hook achieve enlightenment? And has Cindy's mum really got it going on? All these things and more will probably be answered if you check out Champagne and Bullets. And I think the biggest problem this film has is that its script is bordering coherent. I'd stop short of saying I personally found it to be the inane ramblings of a madman, but only by a hair's breadth. A good tip for any budding screenwriter out there, and I'm quoting Planes, Trains and Automobiles here, is if you're going to write a script, and it's a novel idea, but hear me out, if you're going to write a script, have a point. It makes it so much more interesting of an experience for the viewer. This film could, in my opinion, best be described as asleep at the wheel. Scenes just exist, bereft really of any purpose or requirement. The filmmaker has no issue with a 10-minute long dining scene where nothing happens apart from Rick and Cindy sitting at a table while a stream of characters who aren't really involved in the plot come in, talk to the couple for a minute or two, and then leave, never to be seen or heard from again. It's not even so much that some of the scenes are absolutely pointless. The thing that annoys me more is that some of the scenes do have a point that gets lost because the scenes were only required to be 5 minutes long, if that, and instead they've turned them into 15-minute long, seemingly improvised character pieces that, again, add nothing and just go on and on and on. A good example would be when Cindy goes to her parents' house to get the last of her things and a super long cyclical conversation happens where Cindy's dad accuses Rick of being a drug-taking devil worshipper and Rick just repeatedly keeps saying, "I'm not," in a roundabout way. It's just ridiculous. I mean, this is the kind of film that thinks that referencing Hamlet constitutes high art status. The kind of film that will spend 15 minutes running a sex scene and 2 minutes explaining what's actually going on. And it can be at times beyond insufferable. The pacing's pretty damn awful too. The first act is actually not half bad in terms of setting up our heroes and villains, putting our heroes in a tight spot and then introducing the love interest while keeping things fairly light on tone but busy on development. But around the time that Rick and Cindy start reconnecting after cowboy night at the bar, the film pretty much loses its thread and goes completely round the reeking to just put across very simple plot mechanics. The film's an hour and 38 minutes long, and I'd say the first act is about 25 minutes and the final act is about 20 minutes. Everything that happens between those 2 points is utter freewheeling of both the best and the worst kind. I'd hoped with a film like this having multiple cuts that John would have gone back and tried to salvage the film, rework it to make it leaner, more sensical and focused on the plot points and not just 15-minute montages of Rick and Cindy playing with ice cubes in front of a fireplace. But here's the biggest disappointment. None of the cuts achieve anything close to making this film more coherent. If anything, the film makes much less sense the more it's been worked on. For example, you'd think with my main complaint being that the film is too long and incoherent, that the ultra-short Road to Revenge cut would be my preferred viewing choice. But no, because in that cut they've also cut out some key plot points that help define the characters and make the film make sense. So while it's shorter and less focused on showing us that John De Hart's had sex, it's almost totally incomprehensible. In part because they've chopped key points out, but more bafflingly because they've left some of the padding in for some unknown reason. Okay Dan, I hear you say, well, if that's the case, the GETEVEN cut must surely be the one for you. No! Because in that one they're still missing some key plot points and all they've really put back in are the super long, boring nudity and sex scenes and new footage of Rick working outside and shots of the LA Strip. It's not quite as incoherent as Road to Revenge, but now it's got way more of the boring bits back in. There is no good cut of this to me. It's either too long and rambly or too short and incoherent. Though, I suppose if I'm looking at positives, there are points in this movie that are frankly so absurd, weird, or just downright daft that I had to openly laugh at just how unashamed this film is to just be itself. And on that subject, the dialogue for this film, while equally as incoherent, has some absolutely astounding lines in there. Stuff you just couldn't make up. I firmly believe that John De Hart must talk like this in real life, with lines like, "Adiosi Bela Lugosi," and "Listen here, you polyester puppet." I was absolutely delighted, with a personal favourite exchange being when Rick goes to visit Huck in the hospital after his suicide attempt and the pair greet each other by saying, "I heard you did that bleach thing," to which Huck responds, "Yeah." I have no words for this thing. In places it's drawn out, protracted and aimless, but when it hits that sweet spot of sounding like an alien wrote it, oh man does it scratch my bad movie itch. The script was written and directed by John De Hart, with additional direction credited to James Paradise. De Hart has one writing and one directing credit. This film. That's it. This was his only experience of filmmaking, and apart from an acting credit in 2006, he's relatively retired at this point. As for Paradise, this is his only directing credit too, but he's more of an actor, with 33 acting credits including Sleepaway Camp, Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Doogie Howser MD. And, surprisingly, all things considered, the direction isn't too bad. In fact, for a first attempt at filmmaking, I'd say it's pretty damn good. There's a clear vision here, and John's clearly trying his best to really give the visuals his seal of approval. Admittedly, if this had been churned out by a studio, I'd have probably not even blinked in saying that this film was pretty meh. But for a one-man band with no previous experience, it's pretty impressive, honestly. Scenes have clear structuring to them, shots in places seem considered, and the final act is actually rather decently handled. The cast direction is a little bit wobbly. In fact, in some scenes it's pretty much fallen over. But I think here it's a case of taking the rough with the smooth. Again, this was a first-time director with no prior experience of working in film. It's hard to get what you need out of an actor even as a veteran filmmaker. So while it was probably a bit of a looser production when compared to studio-grade fodder in that regard, it's not the worst it could have been. What is fucked in this thing is the continuity, which is just awful. Characters will go from not having drinks to not having drinks again. People will randomly go from standing next to objects to holding them. There's no real concept of time passage, it just goes from day to night completely willy-nilly, and sometimes months can go by in the film without any kind of acknowledgement. In some ways, I like the inconsistencies because it helps make the weirder moments of this film even more unusual. But at the same time, it's an editor's nightmare because the analytical part of my brain won't shut up in pointing out all those weird inconsistencies. On the cine front, it's passable. It, for the most part, looks like a feature film. Scenes have a decent selection of shots that follow a pretty standard formula. There are a couple of bugbears, moments where the camera is clearly being handheld and has to move quickly, often resulting in jerky, very unprofessional shots that instantly pull you out of the action. And while there is a decent variety of shots, I'd have personally been happier with a bit more variety in terms of pans, tracking shots and other bits. It experiments, which is good, though whether those more experimental moments were intentional or just because the filmmaker didn't know that the shots he was using weren't considered standard takes for a production is up for debate. But there was nothing too egregious in here. It's just a not too awful time. And as a quick aside, I do need to mention the lighting here, which for the most part is pretty decent. There are a couple of shots here that stray into floodlit territory, but he handles day for night lighting pretty decently. There are some attempts at chiaroscuro dotted throughout, and in the last 10 minutes things go positively J.R. Bookwalter in terms of shadowy sequences lit by multicoloured lighting gels and hyper-experimentation on shot composition. It looks great in places. On the performance side of things, it's pretty poor. John De Hart appears to come from the Neil Breen school of acting, giving a performance that quite often feels like he's reading his lines for the first time on set, and he wrote the bloody thing. He's dry, overly quiet, he has no physical presence on camera. I've seen taxidermy look more animated on screen than this man. I'm sure he was trying his best, but this strange acting style and choices, while endearing, were not suitable for the grizzled action cop the role required. Wings Hauser appears to be pissed as a fart through 90% of this movie. His performance is memorable in the sense that he appears to absolutely have given no craps throughout. I can only assume that this was a clean paycheck gig for him because he slurs through his lines from start to finish with all the enthusiasm of an Ambien-dosed sloth. Pamela Jean Bryant gives a largely unimpressed performance as Cindy, and it's hard not to see why. She was a Playboy playmate who'd been in shows like The Incredible Hulk and films like Don't Answer the Phone. And here, she's having to spend at least 30 minutes making out with John De Hart. I mean, whatever she was being paid probably needed a few more zeros on the end is all I'm saying. In fact, the only actor here who seems to be somewhere in the realms of decent is William Smith's turn as Normad. He's gravely stern and actually plays a half-decent baddie for this movie. It's just a shame he doesn't really get to sink his teeth into the role, as the film's way too busy watching drunk Wings Hauser piss about in a pool with two models for 10 minutes, or following Rick as he tells rubbish jokes to a waiter for an hour and a day. I mean, he's not astounding, but he's the best of a bad bunch, and I'd have really loved to have seen him be a bit more malicious in this, rather than the odd snippets that we ended up with. Finally, the soundtrack. It's almost all John De Hart. He has a guitar and he's threatening to use it, and boy does he use it. 70% of the soundtrack is just John and an acoustic singing in what sounds like a monologue. It's a more than bizarre choice with very mixed results, almost all of which are hilarious. There's a couple of synthy numbers in this, but nothing memorable, and when it isn't John or forgettable synth, it's royalty-free recordings of classical music. It's probably the most mismatched and incoherent score that I've covered on this season. And while I didn't hate it, I do have more questions about it than answers. Champagne and Bullets' release history is difficult to track down, in all honesty. As far as I can tell, the actual original cut, Champagne and Bullets, had a limited screening in 1993 but ultimately never found distribution. When it was recut into Road to Revenge, it did manage to make it to VHS, but I'm reading conflicting reports about whether it came out either in late 1993 or early 1994. I equally can't find a distributor for this VHS, so in absence of knowledge I'm going to fall back on logic and presume that it was self-distributed by the film's production company, Monarch Productions. In 2006, the film was released again on DVD courtesy of Amadeus Pictures, with some footage put back in alongside additional scenes shot in 2006 as GETEVEN. And finally, in 2021, all three cuts were released by Vinegar Syndrome in a deluxe Blu-ray package which includes full-length commentary by John De Hart, an interview with the man himself, Road to Revenge and GETEVEN, presented in VHS quality alongside a lovely new HD scan of Champagne and Bullets, all wrapped up in a wonderful hardbox numbered set that comes complete with a double-sided poster. Man, this is literally the most comprehensive set this film is ever going to get. Savour it. Is Champagne and Bullets a piece of trash-to-piece theatre? Maybe. While it absolutely has its moments and is very weird in places with some fabulous dialogue, bizarre performances and a script that has ADHD almost as bad as myself, it really struggles to maintain its momentum and frequently gets sidetracked into frankly painful sequences that are just so inane and go on and on and on. It's absolutely a good bad movie with direction and cine that's actually not half bad and a soundtrack that's positively ear-splitting. It has all the elements of a winner really if you're into bad movies, but that poor script structuring is a hell of a ding against this thing, and at the time of writing this film's out of print. I bought my copy for £30 off eBay, which wasn't that far off Vinegar Syndrome's asking price. Is it worth that? No, absolutely not. I can't fault the work that's gone into this release, it's superb, but the film itself just isn't entertaining enough, to me at least, to warrant that kind of cash exchanging hands. I'm not going to get rid of it because I own it now, but if you were to come to me now and say, Dan, I want to buy this movie, it's £30, I'd be telling you to save your money, honestly. There are much greater laughs to be had for much less cash. If you do see it in the wild going cheap though, I'd say absolutely snap it up.